Okay, welcome everyone. Bienvenue tout le monde. We will begin today's press conference with some remarks from our invited guests, aussi avec des discours des ministres, and then we will proceed into a Q&A with media in attendance. So if we could get started.
Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Hello everyone. Merci d'avoir participé ce matin. J'aimerais remercier les invités d'avoir pris part ce matin avec la réunion avec le Premier ministre et mes collègues ministres. I want to thank everyone for being here today and first acknowledge our presence on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We're starting off this conference by inviting Hilda Anderson-Pyrz, Chair of the National Family and Survivors Circle, to share a few words. Is Hilda here? We found her. Hilda, we just introduced you. We can go right ahead. Thanks.
I want to begin by acknowledging the elders, grandmothers, families, and survivors, and two-spirited and gender-diverse people who participated in this morning ceremony. And I also want to acknowledge the family members and survivors and two-spirited and gender-diverse people who are out there watching right now and watching what's being dialogued about today on the 3rd anniversary of the National Inquiry Final Report and the 1st anniversary of the National Action Plan. We recognize each and every one of you and we honor you. My name is Hilda Anderson-Pyrz. I'm the chair of the National Family and Survivors Circle. Our circle is comprised of Indigenous women and gender diverse people who are family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, two-spirited and gender diverse people, and survivors of gender-based violence. Today is the 3rd anniversary of the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. It has been 1 year since the release of the 2021 MMIWG 2S National Action Plan. When our circle was asked to contribute to the plan last year, we were hopeful that this represented a new pathway to end the genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited and gender diverse people. This pathway presents key opportunities to center families and survivors in all work, to use Indigenous-led decolonizing approaches, and to hold all governments, agencies, organizations, institutions, industries, and Canadians accountable to implementing the National Action Plan and the 231 calls for justice. It is with deep disappointment and frustration that I say that the lack of accountability in the past year is staggering and unacceptable. Although the National Family and Survivors Circle was only provided the final draft of the 2022 federal pathway yesterday, we are aware the 2022 annual progress report shows very little progress, particularly on the implementation of the 231 calls for justice that center on accountability. This is a national shame, and it is also dangerous. Each day of inaction in this area leads directly to the tragic loss of human life and further violence. In March of this year, 21-year-old Tatiana Janvier was found killed in Lac La Biche with no arrests were made, no charges were laid, and no answers have been given to the family. In April, 24-year-old Chelsea Poorman's remains were found in a wealthy Vancouver neighborhood after being missing for 2 years, with her mother stating that the police did not treat her initial disappearance with the necessary urgency. 3 weeks ago, an independent jury determined that 26-year-old Chantel Moore's death was a homicide 2 years after the police shot her during a wellness check. 2 weeks ago, vigils were held in Winnipeg for 25-year-old Doris Trout and 24-year-old Rebecca Contois, who were murdered within days of each other. And 6 days ago, the life of my niece, 31-year-old Tessa Perry, was needlessly and cruelly taken in Winnipeg. These young Indigenous women were loved and tragically joined hundreds of women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA+ people who were murdered, went missing, or experienced violence in the past year. I cannot state this enough. Without the political will to create transformative change, this genocide will continue. The government must be accountable for its responsibility to the 231 calls for justice. They are legal imperatives and they are not optional. In the past year, the National Family and Survivors Circle provided a number of accountable recommendations and concrete solutions, especially relating to accountability. However, we've yet to see the adoption of clear timelines and measurable outcomes that are necessary to achieve transformative change that will keep Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA+ people safe. One of these actions is to fulfill Call for Justice 1.7, which is the establishment of a National Indigenous and Human Rights Ombudsperson and a National Indigenous Human Rights Tribunal. In our contribution to the National Action Plan, we specifically stated that these accountability mechanisms be established before June 3rd, 2022. With the failure to meet this deadline, it is clearer than ever that this oversight is immediately necessary to ensure the 231 calls for justice are being accomplished using a decolonizing approach that recognizes human inherent and treaty rights. Impacted family members and survivors are not mere symbols of this crisis. We have a wealth of lived experience, expertise, and knowledge that should be centered in all actions towards ending gender and race-based violence. The relationships that stakeholders have with us must be respectful, ongoing, and collaborative, and we should be included. I would like to leave you with these words from the National Inquiry's final report. The steps to end and redress this genocide must be no less monumental than the combination of systems and actions that has worked to maintain colonial violence for generations. Bigose, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Anderson-Pyrz. We're now going to have Sylvia Maracle, 2S LGBTQIA+ community representative, come up and share her words with us. Sylvia, if you could.
Greetings, everyone. As you've heard, we've just come from a discussion on ceremony and honoring commitments. And we acknowledge that what the Families and Survivors Group has said, and we are members of the National 2S LGBT plus QQIA plus community. And we're also waiting for systemic change. Our change is required both in the federal government, the provinces and territories and municipal governments, but also in Indigenous governance. That we're waiting for a return to power and place. And that requires a great deal of public education go on so that we can combat the sexism, racism, homophobia and transphobia in Canada. That all of the institutions, including those that are supported through public funds and private, that are intended to make our lives better and help us, have to open their spaces so that we're permitted to make our own articulation of our future. We don't need people to say, well, we have this and we're willing to share it with you. We want people to come and say, what is it you need from us? And be willing to share it. We haven't begun to decrease the violence, which is also staggering with respect to Two-Spirit communities. We sometimes can't even live at home. And people are on the street and open and victimized through violence and forced, in some respects, to live by working in the sex trade. And we have to stop that life. I can tell you that there are a couple of things over the last year that we were happy about. It's rare, but it happens. The very first time since Confederation, there was reference in the work that led up to the enabling legislation for the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People that actually mentioned more than the acronym of Two-Spirit. We're actually happy about that because that's a step towards returning to power and place, that we don't have to have a binary worldview, that there's room for everybody in our circle. We can also tell you that, well, it's not without some pain. There have been some support for community development, local community Two-Spirit support groups, cultural groups, education groups, and some provinces and territories and regions and a national body is being developed. That speaks to progress too. The problem is that we're developing institutions that don't have supportive public policy and don't have regularized funding. And quite frankly, in the message to Canada, this is your mess. And we need help cleaning it up. It should not be all on us to do. So if you listen to this and you're working together and government hears us, walk with us. Do your share. Make space, and we'll all find the peace we're looking for. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. And before we hear from my colleague, the Honourable Minister Patty Hajdu, Minister of Indigenous Services, I'll say a few words myself. Before I begin my formal remarks, I want to take a moment of recognition for Rebecca Contois, member of Crane River First Nation, who was found brutally murdered in Winnipeg earlier this week. I want to acknowledge the family and the community for this horrific, unforgivable loss. I also want to put a quick word out for Kandara Ballantyne, whose family is here today. Asked directly the Prime Minister that I wear a picture of her today under the red dress that I'm wearing to honor all your women and 2S LGBTQI people that continue to be subject to this ongoing tragedy. I also want to highlight the loss of Doris Trout on May 19th, Tessa Perry on May 28th, Mary Krug on May 30th, and Grace Blackhawk on May 31st. As a country, we continue to fail Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQI+ people as part of this national tragedy. It's the third anniversary since the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls since it released its final report. It's been 500 years since this began. It's been 1 year since our country took a collective step to address this national crisis and release the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in 2S LGBTQIA+ People's Action Plan. The plan is a first of its kind, and it's the result of work of people here today, some voices that have been left out, that were honored today. But it is something that was key to this country in recognizing the ongoing systemic nature of this tragedy. To mark this milestone, the Prime Minister and my colleague ministers spent a part of this morning in ceremony with family members, survivors, members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community, elders and grandmothers. It was an opportunity for us to listen, to honor their strength, their courage, while honoring as well those that continue to suffer in silence. This is something that, as ministers, the Prime Minister directly needs to hear and continually needs to hear, speaking directly to survivors and families. We know that communities are hurting, and as we reflect on the first anniversary, and as people reflect and digest the progress report that, yes, shows far too little progress, we need to know what we are recommitting to and what we are actually doing as a society to make sure that people get the basic right of being able to be safe and secure in their communities. And that isn't the case today. Things aren't moving fast enough, but they are moving forward. And when you look at some of the work, and I want to be clear, this isn't the opportunity today for anyone to be patting themselves on the back or making any excuses for the ongoing tragedy. The sums that the Government of Canada have invested won't bring people back. They are key to ensuring that this tragedy stops, and most certainly they aren't enough. What the report told us is that change has to be systemic. It has to be from the federal government, from the provincial government, from territorial governments, and from everyone within society, particularly those that carry evil in their minds on a daily basis and contribute to those that continue to disappear. But we do need to take a second to talk about the progress that's happening on a systemic level. The work that my colleagues behind me are doing to address the unfair incarceration of women, Indigenous women in the prison system by moving on mandatory minimums, that for every person unjustly in jail, there's a kid in care being discriminated against, and repeating the cycle of violence that we've seen far too often. The work that my colleague to the left of me is doing in settling historic lawsuits to make sure that the Government of Canada doesn't discriminate against kids in care, and that ends, that we move from a system that you've told us, that the report told us, is one that is based on intervention towards prevention, surrounded by language and culture with their own, is something that is a game changer. But the change doesn't happen overnight. And this is, again, this is not a time at all for excuses, but it's important to look at this through what the commissioners told us, and you, survivors and families, have told us, is that we have to look at this through a systemic lens. And it has to be done across levels of government. The fact that there is forced sterilization going on in this country is entirely unacceptable. It's too simple to say there's a provision in the criminal code that prevents assault. It goes on every day. There are still birth alerts going on in some provinces. Again, unacceptable. And when we look at that, we have to stop pointing fingers and look at the fingers that are pointing inwards at us, at the government, at our role to bring together our colleagues from provinces and territories and say, hey, what are we doing? What are we doing as a country? And how do we move this forward? And how do we make sure people are safe? It's something we haven't done as well, and it's something we need to do a whole heck of a lot better. And as Ms. Anderson-Pyrz, as I conclude my remarks, has said, it can't be the Government of Canada giving itself its own grades on this, good, bad, or otherwise. We need to have an ombudsperson that can actually take stock, has the power to look at these things and say, Government of Canada, you need to do better. Government X, Y, or Z, you need to do better. And look at this in terms of the calls to justice that are numerous, number of them that continue to go unheeded, and hold us to account. This isn't the time for the Government of Canada to be telling everyone how well it's doing, or even how poorly it's doing. And that's something that we will, despite delays, move on in the next year. I'll pass the word over to Minister Hajdu before questions. I just want to thank you all for being here. Je vous remercie infiniment d'être ici, présent aussi aujourd'hui, d'avoir eu le courage de vous exprimer et de vous encourager de vous exprimer, aussi pénible soit la vérité. La tendance étant toujours de nier la vérité, mais nous continuerons de vous appuyer. Miigwech Kuyanamik, Marcy Cho. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. And you know, it's been a long time since my heart has pounded at a press conference. I've done a lot over the last few years, press conferences, that is, and I don't get nervous anymore. But I'm nervous and I'm scared and I'm sad at this one. And I'm nervous because it's so important. The work is so important. I'm sad because we shouldn't have to list out names of women that have recently been murdered, have gone missing. And I'm scared because I know just what a monumental task it is to overturn hundreds of years of colonialism and patriarchy that are intertwined in a way that is almost invisible to the majority of Canadians. I want to thank Sylvia this morning. Your teachings were so real and from the heart. Thank you so much. And Hilda, thank you for the work that you're leading. And we had a conversation just before the ceremony about how the helpers have to take care of themselves too, so that we can continue to be strong for the people that we're hoping to help. It's always an honor to hear from survivors, but I also know that it's a profound responsibility because we've asked survivors to tell their stories now dozens of times, probably more. I know there were survivors calling for justice for decades. In fact, in my own community of Thunder Bay, the issue of missing and murdered women came to my attention only as a 20-year-old. I was 26 years old. It was 1993. And Sandra Johnson's body was found on a cold winter morning in Thunder Bay. And I was at home. I was on maternity leave. That's probably why I even had the time to read the news. And I read the story, and I listened to Sandra's sister Sharon speak about the loss. And then I followed and listened to Sharon's work over the years as she began to walk for her sister. She walked for her sister for 30 plus years. Every year, sometimes with just a few people, just family members, but her work grew and grew. And I know that so many other people who've lost loved ones have felt that no one has seen their loved one, that no one has seen their pain, that no one has heard their stories. So you can imagine how powerful it was for me in 2015, a brand new candidate, coming, by the way, from a shelter that I ran in Thunder Bay, where I saw horrific violence against women, and I saw apathy from the systems that are designed theoretically to protect us all. How thrilled I was to become the minister to launch the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry. I do want to tell you a couple of those stories at that shelter, and they won't shock you as family members. But for the media and for Canadians that are listening, women would get raped. Of course they would get raped. They were living on the street. It was very difficult. And the people that were supposed to believe them would tell the staff at the shelter, she always says that. They would refuse to even take that woman to the hospital. We hired allies to escort women and two LGBTQ people to the emergency room so that they could get service. And this was an ongoing, everyday story. This journey's been too long. And for too many years, as I said, families have walked alone. It is about confronting our institutions. It's about confronting ourselves, especially as non-Indigenous leaders with tremendous amount of power. It's about pushing for equity and justice and self-determination, and yes, honesty and transparency. We've made, as Minister Miller has said, many changes, but we have to do much more, and we have to do it much more quickly. And we have to push systems and structures that were never designed for equity and transparency and inclusion to change. It's my hope that we can change these institutions. Maybe we'll have to start over with new ones. It's a question I ask myself all the time. Can you dismantle colonial power to have equity and inclusion in the way that you choose to govern yourselves as a country, as nations? It's my hope that we'll get there. I know that I will continue to drive forward in every role that I have to ensure that we do reach those principles that Indigenous people have been saying for a very long time. Honor our customs, our traditions, our right to govern ourselves, our right to raise our own families, our right to equity in funding and services, and our right to design those fundings, those services ourselves. Those are the words that I live by and that I am trying to instill in the institutions that I've been responsible for over the last several years. And finally, I will always carry the stories that I've heard, the ones I've heard directly from people I've had the privilege to know and, yes, have lost, and the ones that I've heard through all of you. Those are the stories that propel me to keep having those hard conversations, to keep fighting, to keep getting up, just like all of you, to raise my fist again to colonialism and to patriarchy and to continue that work. Finally, I just want you to know that I know I'm flanked here by some incredible male ministers, non-Indigenous ministers who share that passion. I am grateful to have a team like that. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, ministers and guests. We'll now begin with questions from the room, and then we'll take questions from the phone line. One question and one follow-up, please. Before you begin, please state your full name and outlet. Nous prendrons des questions dans la salle en premier et ensuite au téléphone. Une question et une question de suivi, s'il vous plaît. On va commencer.
It's Fraser Needham, APTN National News. I guess I'll ask the question that's been asked of your government a number of times, and it's pretty much in every press release, and that is, why haven't you appointed an independent ombudsperson to oversee the 231 calls to justice and progress on that file?
Fraser, there's no excuse for it. We really should have done it yesterday. We are working on it, and I hope to see progress within in my department sooner. Minister Lametti has some elements to add, but just to reiterate what we've said quite clearly here today is this is not the place for Canada to be giving itself grades or evaluating what it's been called on to do, and so that role is something that we look on favorably. I've had a number of conversations with Senator Odette on that, who has been pushing that quite forcefully, and we hope to see that put into place in relatively short order.
Thank you, Fraser. If I might add, not on the Ombudsman, but on an accountability mechanism or a human rights body that is independent and Indigenous. I have been working as part of the UNDRIP implementation process and the development of an action plan. I've been working with national Indigenous leadership, in particular ITK, but also AFN and MNC to create that kind of body. So stripping away layers of colonialism takes time, I know, and we all want to have this done 150 years ago. I can only promise to do my best and keep pushing forward.
I guess my follow-up is for the Justice Minister, so you can confirm this will indeed happen?
It began as part of the UNDRIP process. The discussions began as part of the UNDRIP process. We went as far as we could with respect to that act, but now those discussions are continuing, and I know it is a priority for Indigenous leadership, and it's also something that is called for by UNDRIP itself.
Merci. Prochaine question.
Bonjour, Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Si je ne me trompe pas, entre 2015 et 2020, le nombre de femmes autochtones qui étaient victimes de meurtres était de 24% des victimes totales, alors qu'ils représentent 5% de la population canadienne. Depuis l'ANFADA, depuis le rapport, est-ce que vous savez si cette proportion-là a diminué?
On n'a pas le chiffre. On n'a pas de chiffre mis à jour quant à l'augmentation. Votre nombre, le chiffre que vous avez cité est juste. Ce qu'on dit souvent, c'est 12 fois plus susceptible. Ça dépend des régions. Sachez qu'au Nunavut, c'est encore pire. Mais la réalité, c'est que c'est un chiffre qui se confirme de plus en plus, d'autant plus vu les effets de la pandémie sur les femmes autochtones et le monde LGBTQ. Et
si sur ce facteur-là, on n'a pas d'indicateur que les choses s'améliorent, sur quel autre facteur pouvez-vous dire aujourd'hui que les choses s'améliorent?
Bien, Christian, c'est exactement ce dont on discute. Ce qu'on sait depuis le rapport, c'est que la transformation ne doit pas se faire à l'emporte-pièce, ça doit être une réponse de façon systémique. Aujourd'hui, il y a des organisations qui ont eu du financement, qui se sont battues pendant fort longtemps, bien trop longtemps, pour avoir du financement de base pour accueillir les personnes en situation de vulnérabilité. On pourrait citer les investissements qu'on met pour les hébergements pour femmes, que ce soit les 4 hébergements dans le Grand Nord ou plusieurs sur-réserves, hors réserve, tous les investissements qu'on a ventilés pendant les 2 dernières opérations budgétaires. Il y a de l'argent qui sort, mais les effets, l'impact, puis les impacts positifs tardent à suivre, évidemment, parce que ce sont des changements structurels. Ça, c'est mis à part tous les différentes initiatives qui se font au niveau législatif, que ce soit la loi sur les langues autochtones, la loi sur les familles et les services de garde, c'est 92, ou la législation sur la déclaration des droits des peuples autochtones des Nations unies. Ça, c'est de la nature de l'impact systémique de la chose. Alors, ce dont on se fie pour l'instant, c'est le commitment du gouvernement d'investir, de continuer d'investir dans toutes ces organisations et initiatives pour accueillir et pour héberger les gens qui sont en détresse, et je nomme les femmes autochtones et le monde LGBTQ. Mais la réalité, c'est que c'est difficile à chiffrer et que les résultats tardent à suivre. D'où l'importance d'avoir un ombudsman pour cette redevance ou pour pouvoir vérifier les faits du gouvernement, parce que ce n'est pas à nous de nous auto-évaluer, évidemment, dans ce contexte aussi pénible.
J'ajouterais, Christian, qu'on fait des investissements justement pour avoir des meilleures données avec Statistique Canada, mais aussi en travaillant avec le leadership autochtone justement pour avoir meilleures données, parce qu'une partie du défi, c'est le fait qu'on n'a jamais recueilli les données d'une façon basée sur les distinctions.
Thank you. Next question.
Erica Ibrahim, the Canadian Press. Grassroots organizations and frontline groups say there's a disconnect between what's being done at the federal level and how that helps what's being done frontline. What would your response to that be?
Well, first of all, as someone who has worked in not-for-profit for years, one of the challenges that not-for-profit organizations, which are often organizations that serve women, diverse people, individuals that are often disenfranchised from society, is that their work is devalued as well in a colonial system that doesn't place value on human lives. And I mean colonial at all levels. That work is often devalued, and that means that it's not funded in a core funding model, which leads to instability of the organization, high degrees of turnover for individuals that are doing that work. And in fact, it's some of the most important work. In fact, it's connected to prosperous, safe communities. The work that I've been doing as a minister over the years and the portfolios that I've had is to try to change funding models to be more predictable, to be more stable, to try to support organizations in a way that doesn't have that boom and bust cycle. But I think also reflected in the frustration of frontline workers is the lack of affordable housing in all different kinds of settings, the lack of access to equity in healthcare, the kinds of discrimination that people face trying to access everyday basic services. And that is all encapsulated in the calls to action. It's part of the work that I now have the honor of doing as the Minister of Indigenous Services to fight for equity in the budget of the department to build infrastructure more quickly, such as housing, such as clean water, such as adequate health centers in First Nations communities. But it's also work that all of us have to do to push our provincial, territorial, and municipal partners to reform their systems as well. I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play, from the systems and structures that set the tone at the federal, provincial, and municipal level, that trickles into individual attitudes and governance models that are in the institutions that people use every single day. Thank you.
And briefly to add on that, when you look at what we're trying to do as a federal government to explode the categories of the things that we get told we can't fund or we can't do, or that we can only do on reserve, or we can't do things in the urban setting, despite the bitter irony that we've created the conditions for people to be chased out of reserve or to leave as they flee violence or from far reaches of the north, and then be told that we can't work in an urban setting because we don't have the jurisdiction federally to do so. It can be immensely frustrating, particularly for the people here today and who they represent. That's work that sort of goes on in the background as a federal government to explode the authorities and categories that we fund or tell people no all the time to. But it is ongoing, and what we've heard directly from the report is we need that direct relationship. And if there is a disjoint with people in the grassroots and on the ground, that is on us, but it's also work that is the product of years and years of neglect, underinvestment, as Minister Hajdu said, by provincial governments, often the tendency saying these are not your people, we don't represent them, it's up to the feds to do it. That's no longer the way to think, but there still is that institutional reticence to move out of that category. It's work that we do on a daily basis to try and be more sensitive to the reality of the conditions, in fact, we are responsible for having created in the first place, and making sure that those game changer investments that we've announced in Budget 21 and 22, notably on housing, actually hit the ground in the way that is respectful and culturally sensitive to the needs that are out there. Those are the ongoing challenges across department, and perhaps what you're hearing in terms of that disconnect is a reflection of that. But it can be said the federal government isn't moving into that urban area in a way that is a lot more aggressive than it has been in the past, but again, with results trailing.
Follow up? Okay, if there are no more questions in the room, then this will conclude today's media availability. Thank you very much for coming. Merci d'avoir été avec nous aujourd'hui. Bonne fin de journée. Chimiigwech.